Congressional hearings on UFOs. On July 26th, 2023, 3 military veterans testified as whistleblowers in front of Congress to blow the lid off of the government's secrecy and cover-up when it comes to UFOs and alien life on other planets. And it was must-see TV. Now, I don't know where you guys fall on the spectrum of, do you think that we humans and, the other species here on Earth are alone in the entire universe in existence or not? Me personally, I don't think we are. To quote Carl Sagan and the movie Contact, for example, where they re-quote him, it would be an awful waste of space if we were alone. Do I know for sure? Can I point to some concrete evidence of or proof that we're not alone? Of course not. I don't think any of us can. Hence the question, hence the allure of the topic, of the subject. But I love this type of shit and have always been intrigued by it. And not just the conspiratorial side of, space and alien life and stuff like that. I just mean like space stuff in general. Whether it's Elon and what he's doing with SpaceX and changing the game in that realm, whether it's NASA, whether it's Neil deGrasse Tyson and Star Talk Radio, Hubble's telescope images, and so on and so forth. I'm just fascinated by it all. So when these 3 gentlemen testified and they aired it, it was an absolute treat for me. Now, for those of you who don't know, the 3 whistleblowers were, again, 3 military veterans, starting with Ryan Graves, which was the executive director of Americans for Safe Aerospace. Then we have retired Air Force Major David Grush. He was the main guy in this, the main whistleblower here. And then we have retired Navy Commander David Fravor, which he of the 3 is the only one that I knew of. He had been on Rogan's podcast. He had been on Lex Friedman's podcast. He was the Navy pilot who famously was behind the Tic Tac footage video that exists that I'll link to in the episode notes if you guys are interested in checking it out. But it was essentially, he was flying his jet on a training mission and they see this Tic Tac like device or something, flying, I forget, 100, 200 yards away or something like that. And it's doing shit like going from 60,000 miles in the air, or feet in the air rather, to 1 foot above the water in a matter of seconds. Like things that defy what our known technology is capable of, with no signs of propulsion, etc. Going super fast. And he was able to lock his radar, I think is the proper terminology there, although don't quote me on that. But he was able to lock into it and track its speed and its movement. Although he couldn't physically keep up with it, he was able to do so through the technology available on his jet. And that footage was released to the public some years back. I think it's from 2014 or something like that. And it's like one of those holy grail type of pieces of evidence that folks that are like we're definitely not alone, aliens exist, 100% folks, that's something that they always point to. So I knew of him. I did not know of the other 2 gentlemen. I saw before watching, because I actually watched the entire, it's 2+ hours, 2.5 hours plus of testimony in front of Congress. And I watched the entire thing. But before I did, I saw just clips of it online, on Instagram, on Twitter. And the main whistleblower, David Grush, honestly, based on the clips, just seemed like, for lack of a better word, a whack job. I was like, this guy just looks crazy. Something about him or the way he's answering things, at least in these clips, I don't believe a word of what he's saying. Now, when you watch the entire thing in full context, he actually comes off as very poised, super knowledgeable, and credible. Now, that's just, obviously, I don't know for sure. That's just, maybe it's my bias, maybe it's wishful thinking, but that was my gauge of him after watching the full congressional hearing in its full context. I think one of the ways to know for sure if he's full of shit or not is if there's any follow-up to many of the promises he made, or promises might not be the right word, but the offerings he made during his testimony to the members of Congress, which was to provide additional information, specific names, specific proofs, but only under something called a SCIF or SCIF conditions. My understanding of what a SCIF is that for highly sensitive matters or something like that, a SCIF is a room that's designed to block out any and all recording devices, electronics, phones, computers. Nothing is allowed in the SCIF itself. And he said in that type of, top secret, secure setting, he would give them answers to some of the questions that they were asking, which he said by military standards and protocol, he could not give publicly in a setting like this, which was the public congressional hearing, which was fascinating. But yeah, if he came through with all those things, then I think that just adds an additional layer of credibility to him and everything that he was alleging in the public hearings. Now, let me just get a couple of other fun things out of the way before I get into some more important takeaways, in my opinion. Not that the fun stuff is unimportant or anything, but you'll see what I mean. So first thing is shout out to Jeremy Corbell, which was sitting right there in the front row, right behind the whistleblowers. Jeremy Corbell, for those of you who don't know, is the leading researcher and investigator and documentarian of all extraterrestrial government cover-up, UFO, etc. related stuff. And by leading, I mean, in my opinion, and one of the most credible and actually has journalistic integrity and cites sources, and famously did the Bob Lazar documentary, which is a good one for you guys to check out, so on and so forth. But yeah, he was there in the front row. Definitely cool to see him there. Something hilarious was that Tom DeLonge, the singer of Blink-182, was actually referenced in the congressional hearing. He had like a shout out kind of him and the company he started called To the Stars Media. And for those of you who don't know, Tom DeLonge, singer of Blink-182, he went on Rogan years ago. I want to say 5, 6, 7 years ago, talking about, he worked with government and he couldn't say with who, but there's these, stories that are going to start breaking, and that the government is rebranding UFOs to UAPs. And it's the first time I personally ever heard the term UAP, which is unidentified aerial phenomenon, versus UFO, which is unidentified flying object, and all this stuff. And he kind of came off like, this is one of the singers of Blink-182, the band. He's off his rocker. Something's off. But then to hear him referenced in this congressional hearing, which is the most legit place that this conversation can be taking place, is a fucking congressional hearing, right? It's not a documentary. It's not a podcast. It's not happening on some side conversation radio show or something like that. It's under oath in front of the United States Congress, the subcommittee that's in charge of this type of stuff, that's in charge of defense and protecting the United States. So just his mention there was just like, what the fuck? Was he telling the truth the whole time? I just found that nuts. Now, here are some of the more important takeaways. And by important, I just mean more practical, whether you believe in UFOs or aliens or not. These are important points to take away from the occurrence of this congressional hearing, regardless of where you stand. You had members like Congresswoman AOC, which is part of this subcommittee, AOC from New York, and Congressman Andy Biggs from Arizona, specifically asking questions to the whistleblowers of where should they look for certain things? Where should they look for certain information that backs up some of the testimony that he's giving? Where should they look for background related to this information? Where can they find files? Where can they find and get access to footage that he's referencing, or that backs up his claims, etc.? Who can they speak to? Asking specific questions. Kind of like, my takeaway from that was, if they don't know, and they're this oversight committee that's supposed to be, regulating this type of shit, and they're asking in this matter-of-fact way of, who or how the fuck can we get our hands on this type of information? They're completely blind and oblivious to what is going on, if it is in fact going on. So that was a big takeaway for me, either way. Congressman Gaetz of Florida was another one Congressman Gaetz of Florida, and I'm going to play the clip for you guys, said the following in speaking to being turned away from trying to obtain information about a UAP event. And here's some of what he had to say.
Several months ago, my office received a protected disclosure from Eglin Air Force Base indicating that there was a UAP incident that required my attention. I sought a briefing regarding that episode and brought with me Congressman Burchett and Congresswoman Luna. We asked to see any of the evidence that had been taken by flight crew in this endeavor and to observe any radar signature as well as to meet with the flight crew. We were not afforded access to all of the flight crew. And initially, we were not afforded access to images and to radar. Thereafter, we had a bit of a discussion about how authorities flow in the United States of America, and we did see the image. And we did meet with one member of the flight crew who took the image. The image was of something that I am not able to attach to any human capability, either from the United States or from any of our adversaries. And I'm somewhat informed on the matter, having served on the Armed Services Committee for 7 years, having served on the committee that oversees DARPA and advanced technologies for several years. When we spoke with the flight crew, and when he showed us the photo that he'd taken, I asked why the video wasn't engaged, why we didn't have a FLIR system that worked. Here's what he said. They were out on a test mission that day over the Gulf of Mexico. And when you're on a test mission, you're supposed to have clear airspace. Not supposed to be anything that shows up. And they saw a sequence of 4 craft in a clear diamond formation for which there is a radar sequence that I alone have observed in the United States Congress. One of the pilots goes to check out that diamond formation and sees a large floating, what I can only describe as an orb. Again, like I said, not of any human capability that I'm aware of. And when he approached, he said that his radar went down. He said that his FLIR system malfunctioned and that he had to manually take this image from one of the lenses, and it was not automated in collection as you would typically see in a test mission. So I guess I'll start with Commander Fravor. How should we think about the fact that this craft that was approached by our pilot had the capability of disarming a number of the sensor and collection systems on that craft?
Well, I think this goes to that national security side. You can go back through history of things showing up at certain areas and disabling our capabilities, which is disheartening. And for us, I mean, like I said, it completely disabled the radar on the aircraft when it tried to do it. And the only way we could see it is passively, which is how he got that image. So I think that's a concern on what are these doing, not only how do they operate, but their capabilities inside to do things like this.
And how should we think about 4 craft moving in a very clear formation, equidistant from one another, in a diamond? In all of the phenomenon, perhaps, Mr. Grave, that you've analyzed, have we ever seen multiple craft in a single formation?
I have one particular case, and that was during the gimbal incident. The recording on the AT FLIR system shows a single object that rotates. You hear the pilots refer to a fleet of objects that is not visible on the FLIR system, and that was something that I witnessed during the debrief as part of the radar data on this.
So I'm going to cut it off there. You guys can definitely go listen to the rest of it, and I encourage you to, just for the full context. But again, my main takeaway there is how in the dark, or how competing interests are at play, right? So you have the military industrial complex, I'm gonna just name it that, although it's comprised of, folks both in the government sector, the private sector, that comprise some of these entities and groups that may or may not be concealing information. But whoever was on the opposite side of who, as Congressman Gaetz said, they had to re-inform them on how the hierarchy of power, I'm paraphrasing, the hierarchy of power flows in the United States government. And only then was he able to get some of the information that he was seeking. Whoever was on the opposite side of that, whatever that entity is, whatever quote unquote team they're playing for, that's what I found fascinating about that little exchange there. Who are they? Why are they keeping it on the wraps? And how are they keeping it on the wraps? More importantly, which leads to my next takeaway here. You have the chairman of the subcommittee, I think it was the chairman, I want to say Congressman Chaffetz, but I could be wrong there. Someone double check me on that, but was pissed about the fact, and he shared how the Pentagon fails their audits yearly. They failed their audits 5 years in a row, and they have billions of dollars unaccounted for completely, just like we don't know where that money is, as well as over 60% of its assets, of its known assets, also unaccounted for. And it's just, aside from the fact that they failed their audit on a yearly basis, like there's nothing else after that. For example, I'll give you a general big example. I work in finance, as some of you know, for an institution that does work with auditors. And if we fail something within an audit, changes have to be implemented immediately, proof of those changes, follow-ups to make sure those changes work, possible fines, so on and so forth. It doesn't just stop at the audit being failed. You know what I mean? So again, who are those folks in the Pentagon or on the other side of those failed audits that apparently have no accountability? And are those unaccounted for, and this is where the conspiracy theory comes in, or are those unaccounted funds going towards these like shadow government programs? Now, to Mr. Grush's point, one of his statements, again, Mr. Grush being the main whistleblower, when asked by Congresswoman Macy, M-A-C-E, I may be saying that incorrectly, Macy, when asked what agencies, what government contractors, etc., should be called in to a congressional hearing like this one to discuss programs and how they're being funded, etc., like where's the money coming from and what programs exist within this realm. Gersh said that he could give that information immediately after the hearing. He couldn't give it in a public setting, but he said that he can provide them a list of hostile and also non-hostile witnesses immediately after the congressional session in, again, one of those skiff settings or whatever. At which point, a lot of people that were there in attendance, they like woohooed and clapped, and it was a moment. But again, that shadowy governmental cover-up type of thing, that's where I have the more practical, regardless on if you believe there's aliens or not, or if that has anything to do with anything, those questions still remain. And Congressman Burleson from Missouri, which was very skeptical, said, he definitely doesn't believe in aliens or anything like that, came out the gate with that type of demeanor and statement. He asked questions like, could these, retrieved vehicles, because Grush also alluded to the fact that we have shot down and retrieved some of these UAPs, as well as non-human biologics, quote unquote, that's what he called it, and crafts. So Congressman Burleson asked, could these just be weapons and vehicles from other secret departments within the government that we just don't know of? Which again ties back to my initial or my main concern and takeaway here, or my practical concern and takeaway here, which is, if that's the case, who's running the show there? And circling back to what Grush says, which is that the U.S. has beings, or quote unquote non-human biologics and crafts in their possession. A lot of people after the fact were questioning, like, what the fuck does non-human biologics mean? A cow is technically a non-human biologic. He needed to elaborate there, but obviously he didn't. Now, Grush did allude to that, like, the shot callers within this realm of this, like, shadowy government, whatever you want to call it, are a mix of folks that are in the government and folks that are out of the government and part of major corporations. He also referenced something called the Gang of Eight, which sounded interesting to me. I was meaning to look into it, but I haven't yet. So if any of you guys listening know what that is, definitely hit me up and let me know. But yeah, man, what a tangled fucking web we weave. What an interesting time we live in as well. But yeah, I definitely recommend that you folks check out if you're interested in this kind of thing, but just from a historical perspective, it's the first time that a topic like this related to UFOs and UAPs was openly and honestly spoken about in a congressional setting like this, with the most with the most credible witnesses and whistleblowers ever in like the history of the whole UFO folklore scene, if you will. So just from a historical perspective, it's an unprecedented event that occurred. And if you're interested in this topic, this type of thing in and of itself, then it's definitely a fascinating watch. And I will link to the full congressional hearing in the episode notes, but you guys can easily find it on YouTube. if you just search for it, but I'll definitely link to it in the episode notes to make it easier for you guys. And that, folks, was my little recap and review of the congressional hearings on UFOs.